Let's talk about money. Should we raise minimum wage? Beer company Brewdog have told their staff that they will stop paying new employees the real living wage, which is a salary based on the cost of living. Now, currently it's £10.90 an hour, nearly 50 pence more than the national minimum wage. In a letter to their employees, they said that there is no hiding from the fact that in 2023 we made a trading loss, and despite many efforts in the past 12 months to reduce our spending, this is what they say, we still need to find more ways to get this business back to profitability. Inevitably, this means making some hard decisions. Now, given the rising cost of living in this country, is it time that we actually need to increase minimum wage now? Get your calls in. 0207 862 2222 is the number to give us a ring. James, I'll start with you. What do you think about increasing the minimum wage?
Well, it does stick in my throat a bit when I see a cool company like Brewdog that's built its brand on doing things like having a higher wage for its workers, then row back when things get tough for the profit line. That said, do I think that there's scope in today's economy for Britain to uniquely have a much higher wage base than any of our competitors? I don't think we do. The Low Pay Commission looks really carefully at our economy and our competition with other countries. And if we raise it too high, we're going to lose jobs. And they're going to be people who have no job rather than some job. So I think it's probably where it should be, but it should be highly scrutinised because the inflation that people face to pay their bills, it has been really hard in the last year.
But having a living wage and a minimum wage then is just a PR stunt, isn't it, Gina? I mean, shouldn't we just have one wage that you should be able to live on, and that would be the living wage?
Yeah, I'm a supporter of the living wage. But going back to Brewdog before we go more generally, I agree with James that I think it's a bad look for this company, because if you actually look at the wealth of the people who own the company, it is significant. These are individuals who are worth over 261, the CEO, 262 million.
Well, they've done very well.
Yeah, they've done very well. Well, no, because I think as an owner of a business, when you're employing people, it's not just year on year. It's actually more about the long-term profitability of your business, which depends on your staff. And to just look at it on a one-year basis and say, because we've made a loss this year, to then say that we're not going to stand by what is the right thing to do, I believe, which is to have a living wage, not a minimum wage, I think it's a bad look for them. They set themselves out as being a good company. So I think for them, on their own, I think it's a bad move. It's a bad decision from a business owner point of view, and I'm speaking there now as a business owner. But I think when it comes to the general economy, we do actually have a good level of minimum wage in this country. And it's going up in April by 50p. I think it's going up to £11.40. I have a different problem, which is the bands of the age differences. Because I don't understand why it's only £6 something for somebody who starts work at 16 and then goes up to £8.60, and then the £11.40. Those distinctions I don't understand, because if you go to work and you're an 18-year-old and you're going to work, what's the difference if you're going to work when you're a 21-year-old?
Is the argument that you've got more experience by the time you get to 21, and you think a little bit more independently, you can see problems before somebody else tells you there's
21,
one?
well, I think if you're going to work, I understand 16 to 18, but I think 18 onwards, you're in employment.
If you're saying that, because you just said there that you think we've got a good standard of minimum wage in this country.
Yes, because it's set by the Resolution Foundation, not minimum wage, a living wage. I'm saying the living wage.
You said minimum wage earlier,
sorry, the living wage.
No.
I'm a supporter of the living wage. We are supporters of the living wage, and I think the rate at which it's set at the moment, independently, is actually a good level.
So should the government not just scrap the minimum wage?
Yes, I think they should.
And keep a living wage?
Absolutely.
And every employer has to give every member of staff at least the living wage?
It's our policy, and I absolutely think that's what we should do.
It seems shameful that employers would be employing people on the basis that they know that the individual couldn't support themselves on the wage that they are paying for a job that they need done. Does it not, James?
It does, and people have had really tough lives in the last couple of years. If you're doing 18 hours on either the living wage or the minimum wage, you're going to be having a really tough life these days. And companies need to be responsible for that. For Gina, though, on the youth issue, though, we did used to have a problem called the youth unemployment issue.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why that has gone away is that we pay, as you said, a lower amount on the minimum wage for people who are 16 or 18. I think it is tough, and I remember working on the minimum wage when I was a kid. It made me feel, stuck in my throat a bit. But it has solved that problem. And one of the things we need to look at is
people can't leave home. They can't actually move on because they're not earning enough. And actually, quite a lot of employers exploit them because what they're doing is they're having young people doing jobs that actually they should have people who are slightly older.
But if you talk to employers, they say that the state of kids when they leave school today is not good enough.
I know, I'm appreciative of that, and I agree.
You have to pay them less because I'm afraid our employers are having to teach them how to turn up to jobs. I was going to say
that's a different issue, which is that our education system is failing. It's not making people prepared for the work. That is a different argument.
Well,
we have got something.
It is the state of the world at the moment. So these figures reflect that.
Well, we want to get your calls in 0207 862 2222. Maybe you're on minimum wage or you're on the living wage and you're still struggling to get by in a cost of living crisis. So what Brewdog are doing is a worrying sign for potentially things to come in the future. Do let us know your experiences with this 0207 862 2222. It sounds to me like it's quite damning in terms of, the experiences that young people have coming forward. We're saying the education system isn't good enough to actually pay them a living wage when they get into the working environment. And then they're stuck living at home, but even if you paid them a fair wage to be able to move out, there's no homes for them to move into anyway.
The whole system isn't working. We know that, but I mean, in this particular instance, being able to survive, work. I mean, we know so many people who are on credit, who are in work credit, because they're not earning enough. This issue does need to be looked at, and it's not a big ask for companies to be able to pay the living wage.
You say it's not a big ask. One of the criticisms towards increasing the minimum wage, if we're going to talk about that rather than the living wage, if we're going to increase the minimum wage to a better standard, it could have a knock-on effect to inflation. Now, inflation is something that obviously the government are really looking at the moment. Well, wage spirals.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's not only inflation, because if we stuck it up by another £1 in April, for instance, that would have a big hit on inflation. But it's also that jobs would go overseas. If you're a widget manufacturer with factories all around the world, and suddenly the UK's put the cost base up, then you stop investing in the UK and you send the money to Brazil or to China instead. That global competition for investment and for jobs is very real these days, and we've got to keep an eye on keeping Britain competitive.
What would your argument be to that, Gina?
I think we're in the middle of a digital revolution, and actually, if you look at what's happening to the job market, the real issue is the number of jobs we will have going forward that are being replaced by technology and digital and AI, and that means that actually to keep people in employment, we have to pay them a proper wage. But to be able to pay people a wage that they can live on is the morally right thing to do, as far as I'm concerned.
But it may be the morally right thing to do, but it may have unintended consequences further down the line, which I think is what James is saying.
Because what you're doing is that the state ends up intervening. Because at the moment, what's happening is people, as I said, on universal credit who are working, is the state is having to pay it. Actually, if you value your workforce, I understand what you're saying about cheap imports from abroad, but actually that's not so much of an issue in our economy at the moment, because we already don't have productivity, we already don't have growth, we don't have people going into the workforce that are actually producing an economy that's vibrant.
Yes, but we also don't have unemployment, and a lot of countries right now have a lot of unemployment, including
we might
many
not
of our
have
European competitors. And I remember the days when we used to have a lot of youth unemployment. That was completely debilitating, ruined people's confidence. It meant that, of course, they had to stay home and they had tough lives as a result.
But in those unemployment...
The downside of raising the wages to the point that we're no longer competitive is really harsh and should be avoided.
I disagree, because I think that's ignoring the fact that, OK, we don't have those unemployment, but actually we have the figures vary, but 2.3 number of people who are on sick leave.
Yes.
So actually those figures don't come up in the unemployment figures because they don't show up as big.
Yes.
But actually there are people who are not working.
So of the 600,000 people who have dropped out of the workforce, and I'm very concerned about that, they are mainly the people who are later in life, most of them, and there is a mental health issue.
There is a massive mental health issue,
and that is because of stagnant wages, I think.
But young people are also suffering. There's a significant, if you look at the data, a significant number of those people on sick notes or on leave that we're not counting in their unemployment figures are actually young people who are suffering from mental health issues and are worried about things like the cost of living. Our research shows housing, they can't afford to leave home. There's a lot of things that are worrying them as well. It's not just it is across the board.
If we just go back to the minimum wage thing, though, what I'm hearing from you, James, is quite depressing, actually, because what you're saying is that young people have a choice to make and they can have a job, but not enough to be able to go out and have a life of their own. They will still have to probably live with their parents and be subsidised to some level by somebody else because it isn't a living wage, or they don't get a job at all.
No, Storm, I wouldn't put it like that. Listen, at the beginning of your life, you need to learn skills. You need to develop the ability to earn a greater wage. And living on your own isn't a right that is some kind of human right that you're born with. It's something you have to earn into. Actually, the jobs market for young people is incredibly buoyant at the moment. And if you can develop those skills, you can move more quickly through the ranks than you used to in a more hierarchical
and you're certainly
age.
going to be able to move through the ranks if you have a job to start with, even if it is low paid. OK, I get where you're coming from with that. Messages coming in online. We do want your calls on this. 0207 862 2222 is the number. What's your experience with the minimum wage or the real wage? Do you think it's enough to live on? Albert on Twitter says the real living wage never made sense. Obviously, the minimum wage should be the amount required to live. So this was the discussion we had earlier on. I mean, why would you have two?
Yeah.
It does get a little confusing. Michael on Facebook says, wasn't the best part of Brexit that we would raise wages because we were too reliant on low wages from abroad. But now they say that we can't have a pay rise because of inflation. That must be a bit annoying for you, Gina.
Well, there are so many things that were going to be magically solved by us leaving the EU, but we've left, and now this is about how do we create an incentivised workforce that actually can survive on the wages they're getting, and not depend on food banks or credit. And that's where we've got to try and get to. We can't have people not working. In-work poverty is a big problem in this country.
James, going back to something we spoke about a little bit earlier, but this in our first message here with the living wage and the minimum wage, when you've still got a minimum wage, isn't the living wage just a bit of a PR stunt for the government, really? No,
I think it's a helpful aspiration for companies to aim to hit. It sets a standard that companies that are really prosperous and are trying to do their best by their workers can seek to aspire to. I think that's a really helpful form of corporate behaviour. So no, I understand your reservations about it, that it's a sort of a fake thing. But actually, when you're an employer, you want to know what is a good target to be able to aim for, and to have a standard like that, I think it's really helpful. Surely it shouldn't be a target, it should be an expectation that you're paying a wage that somebody can live on. Listen, there are different types of companies. If you're a high margin services company in London, knowing what your aspiration should be is really helpful. If you're in some kind of global fight to the death with workforces around the world, then cost is absolutely paramount. And you may be not able to afford that kind of remuneration because otherwise the jobs will go elsewhere. Well, and particularly at the moment, it's getting more and more difficult for companies because we're all facing a cost of living crisis. Yes. Companies are facing a cost of living crisis too. Brewdog is known for being fairly forward-thinking, a modern company run by modern people, and yet it's having to take this sort of stance. I just wonder whether that's making people at home fearful of what's going to happen down the line and whether other companies are going to take this stance. Well, if you read the Brewdog letter, and it says because of the cost of energy and the cost of products and the cost of production for their company, and I go back to it, for them to have taken, I'm disappointed in them, they've taken a view on a 1 year rather than looking at, because these costs are going to come down as we go forwards. You feel optimistic then that other companies are going to take more of a forward-looking plan? Yes, I mean, this is temporary. There are some 14,000 companies or whatever who signed up to the the living wage. And I think companies understand that part of their attractiveness to employees is how they are going to treat those employees. So I don't think this will become the norm. Well, also, if it's a competitive market for young people, then presumably they're going to have more of a pick if they keep those wages higher. Robert from Cambridge, you're up first.
How do you feel about Brewdog's stance and the approach that they've taken to the difficult times at the moment?
Well, basically what it is... Hello?
Hi, we can hear you, Robert. You're through.
Okay. Basically what it is they're protecting their profits at the expense of their workers and paying the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a slum wage because it keeps people in poverty, and we subsidise business by paying the extra money that these people need to live on.
We do, Robert, but
themselves massive.
I suppose the counter-argument to that, Robert, is that we need the business, we need these jobs, and actually if we demand that these businesses are going to pay higher wages, they might just decide to fold and go elsewhere.
So we have to have people living in slum conditions, working for employers who have massive profits and massive bonuses.
It's an interesting point, Robert. James, do you think that actually, and you've covered it as well, Gina, that you're disappointed that they're taking such a short-term view? Do you think they should be protecting their profits? Maybe they should just decide that they don't take a profit, they don't make a profit this year?
No, they have a responsibility to shareholders to protect their profits. And that is a legal responsibility and a fiduciary duty. I understand that. I think what still worries me about this is a little bit about the hospitality sector in the round. You know, what Robert's alluding to is the tough lives spent by hundreds of thousands of people who work in bars and pubs, which are very often an entry-level job for a lot of people. But for a lot of people, you know, you hinted at it, Storm, they are in sometimes quasi-abusive arrangements where they don't get their tips properly, they have to work over hours, their duties go far beyond what is described in the job description. And I had rather hoped that the hospitality sector was going to be improving and would have the money and the resources to try and create better jobs for people who work in it. This worries me that it's actually going backwards rather than forwards. Robert, thank you very much for your call. Greg from Huddersfield, what's your thoughts on the minimum wage? Is it enough?
Well, my thoughts are that if the government deem this is the minimum that you need to earn, or the minimum that you need to get paid, the government should not be taking anything from that. There should be no tax, there should be no national insurance contributions taken from that if they deem that that is the absolute minimum that you need to be paid.
Well, that's interesting. What do you say to that, James?
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for that view. A problem that is that everyone does need to contribute to society's costs. Otherwise, you're excluding people from any responsibility or accountability for the costs. If you're not putting anything into the NHS or into your pension or into the defence of the realm, then you're excluded as a citizen from actually participating in those important functions. So I agree with the arithmetic of what you're saying, but from a voter and citizen engagement point of view, it's quite dangerous if you're going to exclude millions of people from any responsibility for paying the bills.
I suppose the government would also say it's inbuilt in the tax structure because you get £12,000 or thereabouts
your
before
allowances
your
pay tax. But I think it's galling for people that there are people who do not pay tax, and the loopholes, and you've got businesses who are, particularly online businesses who are not paying taxes in this country. I mean, the whole tax system is unfair because when you have money, you can avoid paying tax, and there are lots of people who do that. We've produced lots of papers at True and Fair on closing tax loopholes. You know, it's not just about, we're talking about people who are working and can't live on what they're earning. We're not talking about the entire system.
So what would you say to Greg? Would you agree with them to a certain extent? What do you think the government should do then?
I think what Greg is saying is, what is your take home?
Yeah.
What is the take home? And I think every single tax needs to be reviewed. And the fact is, I would actually increase the lower band when it comes to when you start paying tax.
15,000, 20,000?
So I think, at the moment, you could look at around 15,000.
Interesting, Greg. Thank you very much for your call. Bill from Manchester, you're up next. What do you think about the living wage? Should actually the minimum wage just be raised to the living wage, and then we can rest assured that actually we're paying people enough to survive?
In an advanced capitalist society, no, it's peanuts. It's peanuts. But to be frank, the whole economic system is based on a 19th century system. There's the competitive business, which itself is negated by massive corporations. Markets are created from nothing, like the mobile phone markets. People can be dumped on the dole. There's no democracy within the place of work.
You have virtually no say, and yet we're supposed to decide every 5 years who's going to rip us off in slightly different ways. The whole system is
so bleak, Bill. Is there any optimism to what you're about to say in this call?
So, yeah. Well, we've got climate change, we've got microplastics. The deepest oceans in the world now.
Oh,
the Mariana Trench, they found microplastics. We don't know what they're doing to us.
I just want to go and hide under a blanket now, Bill. Bill, come on. Right, let's focus on the minimum wage. I hear you just think everything's a disaster. You're not looking forward to the next general election. But if you were Prime Minister then, Bill, what would you do? What decision would you make on the minimum wage? Would you increase it?
I would increase it, but it'd have to be tied to the not just profits, but what the richest owners or whatever it is, the 256 billion they're wasting on missiles, Trident updating, etc.
You're digressing again, Bill. You're doing that thing where you're going way off, and I understand. I have a mind that does that myself. But let's focus on here, and we're talking minimum wage. So you would increase it, and you mentioned there that you would tie it to what the highest person paid. That's an interesting stance.
There
do you
are
think
companies
businesses
who do
can
that.
do that?
Well, there are companies who do that. We know John Lewis, for example, is a company who do that, and you do. And I actually think it's a very fair way of doing it. So you look at a multiple of what the top earner is earning, and then you look at the whole. I was part of the move to remove some of the bonuses, the ridiculous bonuses that are paid, particularly in the city. You know, we have to have a look at what's fair.
You must have been a popular person.
Oh no, I've never been popular, so that's fine. But you know, it's the right thing to do. And these golden handshakes. You know, this did not happen when I first came into the city back in '96. We didn't have these ludicrous amounts of pay and bonuses, and the whole structure has gotten out of kilter. But the other thing to do is also think that when you asked about what reforms, it's also about looking at what the household income is when it comes to taxation, rather than the individual. That rather, you know, because at the moment it's about the individual rather than. But we have to be able, in a modern country like ours, we should be paying. If people are working, they should be being paid a wage that they can live on.